Thank you, and welcome back. Welcome back. So, in the previous session, I told you the story of the kindergarten teacher and her children learning to read. Here's a story from a first grade teacher. This teacher not only teaches the skills of reading, she wants her children to love reading. So she always reads to them from award-winning children's books. She reads to them after lunch when they come in from recess to settle them down. And she uses essential questions around the literary themes of the book. So they talk about the ideas of the story. One year, she had a particularly able group of first graders. They were very strong. So she decided to try a more advanced theme than she had previously used. Is it possible to keep the lights on a little bit? Just a poquito? You can check, somebody could check on that. So and over here too. So she picked a theme of admiration. The kids learned the concept of admire, and they read several stories about people who did admirable things. And they talked about, what do you admire about the person in the story? As a follow-up to reading and discussing 3 stories, she gave the children an assignment. Their task was to think of a person whom they admired, draw a picture of that person, and her directions were, in the picture, I should be able to tell what is admirable, what you admire about that person. So one little girl in her class drew a picture of her mom, her mother, and said, I admire mommy. And when I grow up, I want to be just like my mommy. Here was her picture. So you may wonder what mommy's up to. Well, when the picture went home and her mom asked about the assignment, she was embarrassed and immediately wrote a note to the teacher. Here was her note of explanation. Isn't that priceless? You just can't make this up. So welcome to this session. We're going to go in a little deeper into understanding by design. And I'm going to ask you we're not going to have a design workshop. We only have an hour. But I'm going to ask you, for those of you teaching, think about something you teach and think about through the lens of understanding by design. For those of you who aren't currently teaching in school positions, you can think about backward design for any school or district initiative. I loved what Michael Fullen said this morning, quoting Douglas Reeves, that the best school action plans or implementation plans are short and focused. And backward design helps you do that for any school initiative. So you can think about a school initiative or something you teach as a teacher. And just let's think about how understanding by design could be a useful planning format. So in this session, I'm going to be ambitious. We're going to look at unit design, but it could also be school planning using UBD. And we're going to look at, briefly at least, some examples of long-term transfer goals, understandings and essential questions, which are in stage 1, some ideas for assessment evidence, and particularly assessing understanding in stage 2. And as time permits, I'll touch on some ideas for teaching for understanding and transfer using the letters AMT. Something I promise I'll do before we wrap up is to show you how to get to a wonderful collection of websites with examples from many subjects and grades of teachers using understanding by design so we can work smarter and access good ideas. So I promise to show you those. The ideas I'm sharing with you come from several books. Beyond the basic Understanding by Design book, Grant Wiggins and I have a professional development workbook which has lots of examples, a book that I co-wrote with Carol Ann Tomlinson that looks at understanding by design and differentiated instruction and how they work together. And then if I were recommending a book for someone new to UBD, it would be this book, The Understanding by Design Guide to Designing High Quality Units. This is a more recent book and it is our best advice. There's a companion book to this which is a guide to advanced concepts. So if you were really interested in UBD, you could get both. And these are available from our publisher, ASCD. Our most recent book is a more focused book looking only at essential questions, but lots of examples, lots of ideas. So these are some of the resources that are available for the ideas I want to share with you. So as I did in the general session, I'm going to pause periodically and invite you to converse. You can stand during the 3-minute pause like you did if you wish. So before our break, I presented 3 stages of backward design, and I presented our design template. Now I want to point out something that hopefully you can see from where you're seated, but on our template in stage 1, there are 3 categories. Actually, you saw this in the driving example. The top category is transfer. And the question we ask is, in the long run, what do we want students to be able to do with everything they've learned? And when we say do, we mean apply their learning potentially to new situations. So what do we want them to be able to transfer? In order to transfer, what will they need to understand? In driving, it's defensive driving. It's adapting your driving to different conditions. That will enable you to be a safe and courteous driver. And what essential questions will we use to help students develop and deepen their understandings? And finally, what are the more specific knowledge and skills that the students need to acquire? The 3 categories in gray at the top, another way of saying it, this reflects 3 interrelated goals for teaching. There are knowledge and skills that students must acquire. They're basics. But we want students to come to understand larger ideas. And we've symbolized or acronymized this, if you will, with the phrase make meaning. The idea is straightforward. You can tell someone a fact and hopefully they'll remember it. But you can't tell someone an understanding and they'll grasp it immediately. Understandings are more abstract and it takes time to come to an understanding. The learner has to make meaning for themselves, we believe. The teacher's role is to facilitate meaning making. As a driving instructor, you can't just say, drive defensively. You have to show many opportunities of what that means, and the student has to make sense of the fact, boy, that person just cut me off. I have to be more attentive to all around me. So I'm going to come back to this in a moment. And then the third goal that you saw in our template is transfer. So to make a long story short, when we think about desired results for planning a unit or an entire course or a school program, we think about these 3 goals. What do we want the learner, or in some cases, a staff in a school, to be able to do on their own well? That's a long-term transfer goal. What understandings will they need to do that, and how will we help them make meaning and come to understand? And then what are the more specific knowledge and skill objectives that we need to develop and teach also? So that's what you see in stage 1. One of the things that we've learned in our work in the US and in Australia, given Common Core standards and Australian curriculum, is one of the best ways of understanding the standards is to unpack them. look at the standards of the outcomes in terms of the three categories. Which of the outcomes really point toward long-term transfer goals? Which of the outcomes are around conceptual understandings? And what of the outcomes focus on more specific knowledge and skills? You can better understand the standards or established curriculum outcomes using this framework. So that's just something I wanted to point out to you. So I want to look at each of these elements briefly, and I'm going to go back to stage one and suggest when we look at desired results, we're looking at really 5 different things, and they're working together. Established goals. As you know, established goals are typically in discipline areas, especially from a nation or a state. But we may also have established goals for our school. Those are typically, in this case, on the right side. These are school mission-related goals. So whether you're committed to the 6 C's that Michael talked about this morning, or some other version, these are established by your school, and they deserve attention. They're desired results for our school. Understanding by design works for planning toward both types, traditional academic goals and disciplines, and we might call the 21st century skills overarching goals tied to our mission. So let us look at this category called transfer. This is, to me, a really important way of focusing our attention and prioritizing our teaching. So let's look at long-term transfer goals for a few minutes, and I'll pause for you to converse. In our template, we have a preface statement, and it's right here. As a question, what do we want students to be able to do in the long run, given what we're teaching at the grade or subject where we teach? And an effective curriculum basically is the pathway toward the students being able to transfer their learning on their own in the long run. Just like with the beginning soccer coaches, they want the kids to play the game well, but they're not going to do it perfectly when they're 5 or 6, but that's what we work toward. So here's the good news. I believe there are only a small number of long-term transfer goals within subjects and ones that are cross-disciplinary. So here are a few examples. For writing, this could be our school goal for writing. And you might say, well, of course, that's what we want. As you should. It should be obvious. But let's plan backward from this goal. If we say as a school we want students to write for different purposes and audience, and we specify those, we should see at every grade, even down into the 2nd, 3rd, maybe even below, kids writing for different purposes, different audiences, and we should collect samples of their writing so over the grades we can trace their improvements and their growth. And we do it by design. Here's an example for maths. I could argue that we could have 2 long-term transfer goals for mathematics. Now, of course, there is content of mathematics across the grades, but arguably, we want students to learn the content so they can do these things. Because unlike the example I showed you earlier of the bus problem where the kids memorized the algorithm, plugged in the numbers, we want students to be able to solve problems they've never seen before that require reasoning, that require persistence. They're not obvious, can't plug in the numbers. But if you really understand mathematics you're learning, whether it's fractions or linear equations, you can use the math knowledge to solve real, messy, brand new problems. And I propose that should be our long-term goal, whether you're teaching grade 3 or grade 12. A few more examples. History, social studies. Why do we teach history? What are our long-term goals? I have to tell you, when I look at the tests that I often see in history and social studies, I often see tests of factual knowledge about historic periods. That's fine. Kids need to know historical facts. But my contention is the historical facts are means to larger ends, and we ought to be clear about the reason we teach facts and which facts we teach. So here is a proposition, examples of long-term transfer goals for history and social studies. If we were to agree with, let's say, the first example, then it would mean that in our history and social studies courses, we're not just learning facts about a period, but we're looking at the larger ideas and how they relate to the present and how they will help us understand the future. What can we predict about conflicts in the Middle East from historical examples of tribal warfare, civil war, influence of other powers? Because this is real in many places, and the past can inform our understanding. I chose this example to put in a silly cartoon, so I took it. So I could show you examples from every subject, but I think you get the point. Now let us look at one other example. The examples I've shown you are for disciplinary areas, and I propose that when you boil it down, there are just a few long-term transfer goals for disciplines. So let's look at something that's beyond a discipline, and I'll pick something that you often see in school mission statements. We're committed to preparing lifelong learners. That's a lovely phrase, but what exactly does it mean? Do we agree what a lifelong learner could do, and are we preparing them to do that? Here are 3 examples, not the universe. Let's see if you agree. If we say this is an example of what we mean by preparing lifelong learners, then we should plan backward from that and see in every aspect of our curriculum, across grades, across subjects, kids having opportunities to find, appraise, and use information, and increasingly do it on their own with less and less teacher guidance as we go up the grades. Otherwise, we're not going to achieve this long-term goal, even though it's in our school mission. So in summary, and a pause now, think of the long-term transfer goal as like the game in athletics. What do you want the players and the students to do on their own? And we plan backward from that. This gives us clarity and focus within and across the grades. So 3-minute pause on the ideas you've just heard. Talk it over with your group mates. Stand if you wish. Okay, if I might ask for your attention. I'd like to use the football example to make another point. If we're clear about the game we want students to play, it enables us to plan practice, which is another way of saying when we think about the knowledge and skill objectives, I don't believe it should simply be marching through a list of prescribed skills for a grade level, as much as it is to think like a coach. If we want the students to write persuasively, or to communicate orally effectively, or to solve problems that are tricky and messy, given the students we have, the knowledge and skill level that they have, the content that we're working on, then what knowledge and skills will they need in order to transfer their learning? That's the spirit of this, in my view. So when we look at a unit plan for knowledge and skills, think of the knowledge and skills as enablers for the game, not just for their own sake. Otherwise, you can just get lost in the weeds of covering stuff, and there's too much content to cover, and you can stay lost in the weeds, and the kids never understand or can never apply it if all you're doing is covering knowledge and skills. So, more about that later. So let's look at two other components that work together in stage one, and that's understandings and essential questions. Think of these as two sides of a coin. I really think it's helpful to think of them together. So a couple of ideas about understanding and essential questions. We think it's valuable for those of you who are teaching to look carefully at the content objectives or the curriculum outcomes and unpack them. And one way to unpack them is to ask the question, what are the conceptually larger, important ideas within this content? In some cases, they are very clearly identified, but in some cases, you have to find them, you have to extract them. So here's a visual that I like, maybe you will. The big ideas are abstract, they're often below the surface, particularly for students. And sometimes for teachers, we have to go find them. So we have a number of methods for doing this, and I'm not going to have time to get into all the methods, but I'm going to show you some examples of understandings with the following point. When we think about identifying a desired understanding, it is inherently abstract. It's a concept like defensive driving, or a theme, injustice, or a principle, force equals mass times acceleration. But these are abstract ideas. They're not obvious and they're not factual only. They require something more. These are also transferable ideas. And think about it, a fact doesn't transfer. Bogota is the capital of Colombia. That's factual. That doesn't transfer. The concept of a national capital is a larger and more abstract idea. We can have questions about it. Why is the capital in Bogota? Was it somewhere else? Could it be somewhere else? And so on. You can play with an abstraction, and it's transferable. We can say Buenos Aires or Washington, D.C., and work at the concept of a national capital and its location and its purpose. That's different than the facts. Another recommendation in understanding by design, and you'll see this on our planning template, when you're asked to identify desired understandings, we're asked you to frame them in terms of this stem. Students will understand that, fill in the rest. So let's look at a few examples of such understandings. Here's an example for an idea in literature, or more generally in communication, the idea of satire. This is not obvious, and sometimes when students are introduced to satire, they think it's pretty cool. You can make fun of other people. But a deeper understanding of satire is that this is a deliberate literary technique for exposing something that you want to expose, immorality, something that's illegal, something that's improper, something that's stupid. And you use indirect forms of expression to convey that idea. That's tied to a more general idea that writers and speakers don't always mean exactly what they say. There are indirect forms of communication. These are abstract ideas, but it's a powerful form, and kids that understand it are able to appreciate satire and even use satire. Here's an example for something we would teach in mathematics, or science, or statistics. Now, these are 3 examples of understandings that build from simpler to more sophisticated. When we're teaching about measurement, one of the things we want students to understand, even young kids, is that we can measure the same thing in different ways. There are different tools of measurement. There's metric measurement, there's US system of measurement, and so on. A more sophisticated idea is in the center, that almost all forms of measurement have some measurement error. Standardized tests have measurement error, and it's important to understand what the error measures are. Another question is, how much error can we tolerate? In some cases, an estimate allows us more error, but parachute packing, we want minimal margin of error. And a more sophisticated and very abstract idea is at the bottom. The fact that things might be correlated doesn't mean that one thing causes another. These are abstract ideas, but they're ones that we could teach and develop under the topic of measurement, albeit over the grades, different grade levels. How many of you work with very young children? Kindergarten, first grade, K1? I recognize that with very young children, there may not be as many big ideas. You're doing more with basic skills and so forth, but there are nonetheless important ideas that you want young kids to understand. It just may not be for everything you teach. Here's an example that I got from a first grade teacher. In fact, it was around her reading of a story called Frog and Toad Are Friends. Or are they? Because here was one of her understandings she wanted her kids to come to. And in reading the story, there were times when Frog and Toad aren't acting very friendly. But the deeper idea is not friends are just people that you like to hang out with and have good toys, that there's something called true friendship, and that was an idea she wanted to develop. So those are some examples. Now, one other thing I want to show you before I pause. I want to look at the connection between understandings and essential questions. Remember I said, think of them as 2 sides of a coin. So not only are you thinking about what you want students to understand about the topic you teach, but what essential questions could we use to engage students in coming to understand those ideas? And let me show you a few examples. Here are some examples of the kinds of questions we call essential. And notice the last question, you could plug in different periods. Who were the winners and losers in Europe during the Industrial Revolution? Who were the winners and losers in today's global economy, increasingly driven by machines, as Young reminds us this morning? You'll notice that questions like this are qualitatively different than a question you might ask to see if kids remember things. Essential questions have certain characteristics. They're open-ended. There's typically not a single right answer. You have to ask the student to explain their answer, like one of the verbs from What is Understanding this morning. A good essential question should engage the mind. It should make you go, I wonder about that. It should engage students in wanting to make meaning. A third characteristic of such questions, good essential questions spark other questions. What if you just like a person, but they're not helpful when times are hard? Does that mean they're not your friend? Is the enemy of my enemy my friend, really? Would they be true friends? How do I know who a true friend is? Questions lead to other questions. And finally, for me, a good essential question can and should recur. And here's a practical tip. If you have one or several essential questions for a topic you're teaching, post them in the room. Keep them on the wall, because you want to come back to them again and again. They're essential. They're not a question you ask once and then you're done with. So let's look at a few examples, and then I'll pause for you to converse. In fact, I'm going to show you some examples of understandings with companion essential questions. So here's an understanding around the big idea of adaptation. Over time, we want students to come to understand that living things and populations of living things adapt in order to survive harsh or changing environments. What could be an essential question related to that? Here's a straightforward example. In what ways or how do living things adapt to survive harsh or changing environments? One approach to identifying an essential question is to turn the understanding into a question. But you might say, well, why do you do that? That's redundant. I mean, that's like the same thing, really. Yeah, but here's the difference. As a teacher or a team, I want to be clear about what I want students to understand. The essential question is like a doorway. By going through and exploring the question, we want to develop and lead students to make meaning and come to understand. And we're in a planning phase right now. We're planning a unit. But when the kids are in the room and I'm teaching, personally, I'm not going to give them that understanding. They have to earn it. They have to make meaning. I'm going to give them the question, however, and I'm going to study examples of living things that have adapted. And I want them to come to the understanding that living things will change or they won't survive, like Nokia phones. So my point in showing you this is one way of generating essential questions is right off of your understandings. But you don't give the understandings to the students, at least right away. You want them to earn it. You'll give them the question. It'll be on the wall. But here are a couple of other examples, and then I'll pause. Here's an understanding about great literature. This is in adult language. I don't think children or young people would talk this way necessarily, but you see the idea. Look at this wonderful essential question from a grade 6 teacher. How can stories from other places and times be about us? What a great question for connecting literature to the kids. And over time, we want the kids to say, wow, that story, I can relate to that character. I got an insight from this story about me, because that's what great literature is and does. Here's the first grade example once again, and the essential question used by the teacher. Who are your true friends and how would you know? So one more example. Let's go back to lifelong learning. If lifelong learning is one of our long-term transfer goals, and we've described what we mean by that, what we want students to do, well then what are understandings related to it? Well, here are two possible understandings. To be a lifelong learner means that you should understand something about yourself as a learner. And the more aware you are of your own learning and your own strengths and your own weaknesses, the better able you will be to be an effective learner. Another understanding is that there are strategies and tools that can help you, whether they be technology tools like graphic organizers or Excel spreadsheets or Google sites, or strategies like mnemonics that can help you remember. Lifelong learners employ strategies and tools. We could then have a set of essential questions related to this long-term transfer goal. And these are questions we don't ask once. We would ask these again and again. And as students mature, their understandings and their answers would become more sophisticated. Okay, one last example and couple pictures, and I'll pause. For those of you who teach skill areas, it's tempting to cross out that and put how to. I want students to write persuasively. My request is don't do that. Rather, think about what students will need to understand to be effective persuasive writers. To say it another way, what do the best skill performers understand that the novice doesn't? Same with driving. So here's an example or two. Effective persuaders match their technique, their strategies for persuasion, their examples to their audience. How we try to persuade our friends to do something is not the same as we'll try to persuade our school board to change a policy. That's an understanding about persuasion, and there are others. So these are just some examples of the category called understandings and essential questions. Permit me to show you a couple of pictures and then a pause. These are from classrooms where teachers use essential questions. They're posted and they come back to them again and again. These are questions hanging in a theater black box room. How does feedback affect performance? How does technology change the arts over time? How do the arts reflect as well as shape culture? And here's an example of essential questions posted in the science department. They're put on coffee mugs, so the science teachers look at them every day. They had a set of overarching essential questions for their science program. So those are some examples. Let me pause and give you a chance to talk once again. Stand if you wish, to just respond to what you've heard me say about understandings and essential questions. In about 10 minutes, I think I'll try this.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Get one.
Yes.
Another person.
Okay, I wanted you to know that Grant Wiggins and I put up a website, and the website is just essentialquestions.org. You can go to the website and find sample essential questions, videos of teachers using essential questions in their classroom, and we have something called the Essential Question Exchange, which is an opportunity for anyone who has a good essential question to share it. And it goes into a database where you can get access to lots of questions. This is free, a click away, so go to essentialquestions.org. It's one of the websites I wanted you to know, and I'll show you another really big set in just 15 minutes or so before we wrap up. Okay, I want to take a few minutes to look at stage 2, and then I'll show you websites before our time is up. So stage 2 of backward design is where we think about evidence. If these are the desired results, knowledge, skill, objectives, understandings, and long-term transfer goals, what evidence of learning and understanding do we need? Well, one of my favorite cartoons about assessment evidence is 3 parts. Assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. We taught that, but what did the students learn from our teaching? Yeah, I covered that, but do they understand, and what's the evidence? Anyone interested in teaching and learning is, or should be, interested in assessment. It helps us answer the question, did they get it? The logic of backward design is crystal clear on this point. We ask you when you're planning, whether you're planning a unit for kids or an implementation plan for your school, to think not only about your results or the goals you're after, but the evidence that you have attained those. And we think carefully, like an assessor, before we get too invested in planning our lessons or our implementation activities. An analogy that I'm fond of, being an amateur photographer, is this one. Think about assessment as photography. Any single assessment, a quiz, a test, a performance task, a skill observation of a skill, a standardized test like Cambridge, any and all of those things can be thought of as like a picture, a photograph, a snapshot. But we recognize that any single snapshot, any single photograph is going to be incomplete. Better assessment evidence comes from a collection of pictures taken over time. Some will be close up, some will be wide angle. And so there's no one best assessment, nor is one assessment snapshot sufficient. Especially because we have varied goals, different goals, we need different kinds of pictures in our album. And we know that there are many different kinds of assessments from which we can get evidence of learning. Here are a few familiar types. But how do we choose the assessments we use? Well, the cartoon makes a humorous and serious point at the same time. For some things we teach, a paper and pencil test, even multiple choice form, is effective, efficient. We use it. It's fine for some things, but not everything. For some things, some of our goals, we need the students to actually perform. It's like driving, if you think about it. There's a written test to see if you know the rules of the road, but there's also a driving test, because driving is a performance activity. To only have a written test would be insufficient. We need more photos in our album. So the Understanding by Design template in stage 2 basically has 2 broad categories of assessment types. Performance tasks that we think are the most appropriate evidence of understanding and the ability to apply your learning. After all, that's what a performance task is. We give the students a situation where they have to transfer their learning and explain it, show their work, and so on. But we also have other assessment evidence, which can be a quiz to see if you know the facts, a skill check to see if you're getting better on a particular skill. So it's not either or, the different photos in our album. Now, I want to leave you in this, wrap up this session by showing you a very practical, specific technique that you can use individually or with your teammates to check the alignment between your goals, your desired results, and your assessments. And so I'll wrap up with this, and I'll show you websites very quickly. Here's the idea. Stage 1, Stage 2. We want the train tracks aligned. We want our assessments to match appropriately and give evidence of our goals. So here's how this works. If you're planning a unit using Understanding by Design, and you've thought about Stage 1, the transfer goals, the understandings and essential questions, knowledge and skill objectives, now you are in Stage 2, and you think about the performance task or tasks, as well as other evidence. And here's what you then do. Cover up Stage 1 so that only the assessments for your unit are showing, and show another teacher or a team and ask them to tell you what they think your goals are if only they can see your assessments. Do you see how that works? It's a very quick but very good check to see if there's good alignment. Let me wrap up by showing you a unit that I wrote. I'm only going to show you my assessments, and I want you to say to your group mates what you think would be in Stage 1. You ready? The unit I wrote was on nutrition. It was for grade 6 students, and it's about 4 weeks in length. Here are my assessments. There were 2 performance tasks. The first, you are what you eat. The 6th grade students have to create a picture book that they could use to teach 1st graders all about healthy, balanced eating, and show them 2 possible problems, health problems resulting from poor nutrition. And the second task is at the end of the 4 weeks. They have to apply everything they've learned about nutrition to create a menu plan for meals and snacks for a camping trip. And I tell the kids that there is refrigeration on the trip, so you don't have to worry about that. But your menu plan must be healthy and balanced. You can see other assessment evidence below. So if these are my assessments for a 4-week unit on nutrition, what do you expect to find in Stage 1? Talk it over with your group mates. So before we wrap up, I want to hear what you have to say. We have 2 people with microphones. So I want just, if you would raise your hand, tell us one of the things you expect to see in Stage 1. I want to hear from you, and then I'll show you, and we'll see if my train tracks are aligned. So someone get us started. What do you expect to see in Stage 1? Goal, an understanding, an essential question, knowledge, skill. Here's one.
One would be that an understanding that the food that you eat affects the way that your body reacts.
Okay, so an understanding the food you eat can affect how your body reacts and has effect on your body. Thank you. Let's hear others. I'll show you in a minute. Here's one.
An essential question is, what is it to be healthy?
What is it to be healthy? And how does eating contribute to your health? Could be a set of essential questions. Thank you.
The question would be, what kind of food is healthy? And the big idea would be there are healthy food options and unhealthy food options.
Very good. So what foods are healthy? And there are healthy and unhealthy food options. Here's one over here. Right there? We're almost done, but I
I
want to finish
think
this.
that students will understand that if they eat unhealthy food, it has a consequence.
That there are consequences to poor eating.
Or to,
That's
yes, to
an
making the
understanding.
wrong choices when eating is concerned.
Very good. Thank you. Knowledge, skill objectives? Anything not yet mentioned? What is a balanced diet? Could be an essential question.
Sorry, as a long life learning, I think it would be to have healthy food habits.
As a lifelong, long-term transfer goal, to have lifelong healthy habits. Thank you.
Anyone else?
All right, one more, and then we'll pause with our schedule.
No, I think this question of choosing, that they become aware that they can choose what they eat.
That they have some choice in what they eat, and there were healthy and unhealthy choices. Very nice. All right, so let me show you. Thank you for taking the microphones around. Here's a summary of stage one. Starting with an established goal, which is on the left side, from a national health curriculum. So how do my train tracks align, do you think? Actually, I shouldn't ask you, I should ask me, because that's how this works. I heard you, and I need to see, did what you see line up with what I intended? I think in general it did. Would you agree? So I wanted to show you this. This is something you can do quickly with a couple of people or another teacher, but it really helps you make sure that your assessments are lined up with your goals, and it's always helpful to get another set of eyes on your work. So this is a technique that I wanted you to see. There's much more to say about understanding by design, but I'm mindful of our schedule, so I'm going to jump right to the end and share with you some websites. And for some of you, this will be worth the price of admission. If you go to my website, which is justmyname.com, from the home page, you can go to resources, right up at the top. It's my older brother, by the way. And under resources, there's a link of UBD supportive websites. There are 31 pages of hot linked websites, general and subject specific. There is a great collection developed in the state of Massachusetts with over 100 high quality UBD units from pre-K to 12 in mathematics, science, social studies, history, social studies, and science. And there are many other resources there. There are also other resources, including articles and videos that you can get from the website, and the price is right. So thank you for hanging in there. It's been a long day. I'll leave you with my parting shot.